Time now for the latest business news. Solange Moujon from our business desk is here with us. Hello to you, Solange. Related to that last story just discussing, you're looking at the cost of protecting French citizens in light of these terrorist threats.
Yeah, in France, there is a military mission that is made specifically to protect people against terrorist threats. It's called Opération Sentinelle. And these soldiers are a regular presence throughout the year. But with the current security threat, the government has deployed more of them to do things like patrol on foot, averaging some 30 kilometers a day. Georgina Robertson has more on how much this force costs and how it is still being used, despite some criticism over its very large mission.
Their presence is bolstered when the country is on high alert. French Operation Sentinelle is made up of soldiers specifically deployed against terrorism. In the wake of the murder of a teacher in northern France on Friday, the Élysée announced the deployment of 7,000 such soldiers to reinforce national security. According to the government, this new deployment will be completed by Monday evening.
When we go to this level of vigilance, first of all, it's to tell all the French people and all the authorities to be careful. This will enable our military friends in Operation Sentinelle to step up their efforts, so there will be a few thousand more soldiers deployed to help guard shopping centres and protect all French people, obviously, in their everyday lives.
Formed in 2015 after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the Sentinel Patrol's aim is to defend and protect the French people against terrorism. In 2015, 10,000 soldiers, including 3,000 reservists, were in its ranks. But this security comes at a price. In its first 5 years of existence, Operation Sentinelle cost €3 billion. The French body responsible for auditing the use of public funds recommended disbanding the operation in 2022. It found Sentinel soldiers had intervened over 18,000 times, but only 6 of these events were categorised as terrorist activity between 2015 and 2020. But the government remains attached to the force, possibly for financial reasons. In 2016, French MPs calculated that using Sentinel soldiers rather than police officers saved around €900 million per year, as they're often younger and paid less than police officers.
Yeah, Solange, it's not just Sentinel soldiers that have lower wages, shorter contracts, and less overtime. That situation being discussed across France today at a government conference.
Yeah, the talks are being called a conférence sociale, or a social conference. They were promised by Emmanuel Macron as a response to anger over inflation. The last such conference was held nearly a decade ago. Now, in addition to the Prime Minister and half a dozen other ministers, all of the 7 major labor unions are in attendance at the conference, as are unions that represent French businesses. Now, the main topic of these talks is les petits salaires, or low-paid jobs. But there's also a discussion of how salaries stagnate, as well as part-time contracts, and added at the very last minute, the pay gap between men and women in the workforce.
How much of to what extent are low salaries a problem here in France?
Well, if we look at protests that occurred across France last Friday, salaries are one of the top concerns among French people. Lower and middle-class households have been hit very hard by inflation, especially those that earn the minimum wage of €1,383 after taxes. This is called le SMIC in France, and it is indexed to inflation. Because of this, it has gone up by some 10% in the past 2 years. Back in 2021, already 15% of the population was paid this minimum wage. Now, as the SMIC, the minimum wage, has gone up, this means that many of those earning just above it have slipped to that minimum. And in addition to this, there are also some 70,000 sectors or branches of the workforce where specific pay guidelines are below that minimum wage. This is actually one of the main sources of anger among labor unions at the conference.
We need a government that enacts laws and guarantees the purchasing power of workers. I want to say to employer unions that in addition to being a social catastrophe, their agenda of salary austerity has economic consequences, because today entire sectors are struggling because salaries are low.
So, Solange, what are the proposals of the conference?
Well, Elisabeth Borne, the Prime Minister, said she's going to propose the creation of a group that will specifically work on salaries going sector by sector. And on top of this, part-time work and also government hiring schemes and tax incentives they have for employers are also being discussed. Many labor unions say that certain tax exemptions need to be changed because, in their view, they can encourage salaries to stay low in a country where it's very important to remember 4.8 million people live on less than 950 euros a month. Many of these people have jobs and they are still living below the poverty line. The conference is also sort of a means of testing the temperature of the room of sorts between the government, businesses, labor unions, who have so far remained relatively united since the pension protests in France.
All right, Solange, thank you very much. Solange Moujon with a look at some of the business news.